The morning sun barely broke through the thick gray clouds hanging over the city's edge, where the sprawling garbage dump stretched like a wound across the earth. Mountains of refuse rose and fell in grotesque waves, colored by rust, rot, and the faded remnants of discarded lives. The air hung heavy with the stench of decay, mixed with the acrid smoke from small fires that burned endlessly among the trash. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries sharp and desperate, competing with the rumble of approaching garbage trucks. It was here, in this forgotten place where the city dumped everything it no longer wanted, that Miguel Santos made his living. He was a small man, barely 4 feet tall, with broad shoulders that carried the weight of a lifetime of stairs, whispers, and closed doors. His face was weathered beyond his 38 years, marked by deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too many hard days under the sun. But those same eyes held something rare, a warmth that refused to die, a gentleness that the world had tried and failed to crush. Miguel pushed his modified cart through the narrow pathways between the garbage heaps, his hands protected by worn gloves, his back bent to the work. He was a recycler, one of dozens who came here each day to salvage what they could: plastic bottles, scrap metal, cardboard, anything that could be sold for a few coins. It wasn't much of a life, but it was honest work, and Miguel had learned long ago that honest work was all he could hope for. The regular jobs, the ones with dignity and steady paychecks, those weren't for people like him. The world had made that clear enough times. He had been at the dump since dawn, working methodically through a fresh section where last night's trucks had deposited their loads. His movements were practiced, efficient: grab, sort, toss into the cart, move on. Plastic here, metal there, everything else left behind. The sun climbed higher, and sweat began to trickle down his temples despite the cool morning air. Then he heard it, a sound so faint, so fragile, that at first he thought it was just another gull. But something made him stop, his hand frozen halfway to a crushed water bottle. He tilted his head, listening. There it was again. Not a bird, but something else, something human. A whimper, weak and desperate, coming from somewhere deep within the nearest pile of garbage. Miguel's heart kicked hard against his ribs. He dropped what he was holding and moved toward the sound, climbing over bags of trash, his short legs working double time to navigate the unstable terrain. The smell grew worse as he got closer, and flies rose in angry clouds around him. He called out, his voice rough from years of breathing in smoke and dust. "Hello? Is someone there?" The whimpering stopped, replaced by a frightened silence that was somehow worse. Miguel pushed aside a torn mattress, shoved away a broken chair, his hands moving faster now, driven by something he couldn't name, and then he saw her. She was tiny, impossibly small, curled up in a hollow between garbage bags like a discarded doll. At first, his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. Surely this wasn't real. Surely no one would leave a child here, in this place of death and waste. But she was real. A little girl, no more than 4 or 5 years old, with matted black hair stuck to her face and neck. Her skin was covered in grime and scratches. Her clothes, a torn pink dress that had once been bright, now gray with filth. Her eyes, enormous in her gaunt face, stared up at him with a terror so pure it nearly stopped his heart. "Oh God," Miguel breathed, his voice breaking. "Oh God, oh God." He moved toward her slowly, carefully, the way you might approach a wounded animal. She shrank back, pressing herself deeper into the garbage, a small moan escaping her cracked lips. Miguel raised his hands, showing her his palms, his eyes flooding with tears he didn't bother to hide. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's okay, Pequeña. I'm not going to hurt you. I promise. I promise I won't hurt you." She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him with those huge, terrified eyes. Miguel could see her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress, could see how her tiny body trembled with cold and fear and something else. Weakness, the kind that came from days without food or water. How long had she been here? How long had she been alone in this hell? The questions could wait. He pulled off his jacket, an old denim thing with patches at the elbows, and held it out to her. "Here," he said softly. "You're cold. Take it." She didn't reach for it. She just stared, her lips slightly parted, her breathing quick and shallow. Miguel's throat tightened. Slowly, moving like he had all the time in the world, he crouched down to her level. The garbage shifted under his weight, but he kept his eyes locked on hers, trying to pour every ounce of safety and kindness he possessed into that gaze. "My name is Miguel," he said quietly. "What's yours?" Nothing. Not a word, not even a blink. Just that terrible, empty stare. "You don't have to tell me," Miguel continued, his voice steady despite the fear pounding through him. "That's okay, but you can't stay here, Pequeña. This place, it's not safe." "Will you let me help you? Will you come with me?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. The seagulls went silent. The smoke stopped drifting. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then, so slowly that Miguel almost didn't see it, she moved. Just a tiny nod, barely perceptible, but it was there. Relief crashed through him like a wave. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, good. I'm going to pick you up now, is that all right?" He didn't wait for an answer. Gently, carefully, he slid his arms under her frail body and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, lighter than his cart when it was empty, light enough to make him want to cry. She stiffened at first, her body rigid with fear, but she didn't fight him. Miguel held her close against his chest, wrapping his jacket around her, and began the careful climb down from the garbage pile. Every step was measured, deliberate. He couldn't afford to fall, couldn't risk hurting her more than she'd already been hurt. His arms ached, not from her weight, but from the terrible tenderness of the moment, from the responsibility of carrying something so precious and so broken. When he reached solid ground, Miguel looked down at the child in his arms. Her eyes had closed, her head resting against his shoulder, and for one terrifying second, he thought she might have died. But then he felt it, the faint flutter of her heartbeat against his chest, the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. She was alive, barely, but alive. He didn't think about what came next, didn't think about the hospital bills he couldn't pay, or the questions that would be asked, or the authorities who might take her away from him before he could even learn her name. All he thought about was getting her somewhere safe, somewhere clean, somewhere warm. Miguel carried her out of the dump, his cart forgotten behind him, his day's work abandoned. The other recyclers watched him go, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, but he didn't care. He walked the 2 miles to the nearest bus stop, ignoring the stares from people who saw a dwarf carrying what looked like a dead child. He got on the bus, dropped his coins in the slot, and sat in the back, cradling her against him, whispering promises into her dirty hair. "You're safe now," he told her over and over. "You're safe. I've got you. You're safe." The clinic was a small place, run by a tired doctor named Dr. Hernandez, who'd seen everything this neighborhood had to offer, and then some. When Miguel walked in carrying the girl, the waiting room fell silent. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. "Doctor!" she called, her voice sharp with alarm. "Doctor, now!" Dr. Hernandez emerged from the back, took one look at what Miguel was carrying, and her professional mask slipped just enough for Miguel to see the horror underneath. "Examination room 2, she said, her voice clipped and efficient. "Now." What followed was a blur of activity, hands taking the girl from him, voices asking questions he could barely hear over the roaring in his ears, bright lights and antiseptic smells, and the sound of his own ragged breathing. They made him wait outside while they examined her, and he paced the narrow hallway like a caged animal, his hands shaking, his mind racing with terrible possibilities. When Dr. Hernandez finally came out, her face was grave but not hopeless. She gestured for Miguel to follow her into a small office and closed the door behind them. They sat, and for a moment the doctor just looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Tell me how you found her," she said finally. Miguel told her everything. The dump, the sound he'd heard, the way she'd been hidden among the garbage like something thrown away. His voice broke more than once. and he didn't bother to wipe away the tears that ran down his face. Dr. Hernandez listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with every detail. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath. "She's severely malnourished," she said quietly. "Dehydrated, covered in cuts and bruises, some of which are infected. She has a fever, probably from the infections. She hasn't spoken a word since you brought her in. I'm not sure if she can speak or if she's simply too traumatized. She's also terrified of everything, everyone." Miguel's hands clenched into fists on his lap. "But she'll be okay? She'll live? If you'd found her a day later..." Dr. Hernandez shook her head. "You saved her life, Mr. Santos, but the road ahead won't be easy. She needs more than just physical healing. That child has been through something unimaginable, and there are complications." "What complications?" The doctor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm required by law to report cases like this to Child Protective Services. They'll want to investigate, find out where she came from, whether there's family looking for her, and they'll want to know why you had her." Miguel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You think I did this to her?" "No," Dr. Hernandez said quickly. "No, I don't. But I'm not the one who makes those decisions. CPS will interview you, investigate your background. And Mr. Santos, I need to be honest with you. Your situation, your condition, it might make them less likely to consider you as a placement option for her." There it was. The truth he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd picked her up. Of course they wouldn't let him keep her. Why would they? He was poor, lived in a tiny apartment, barely big enough for one person, worked in a garbage dump. And he was a dwarf, which meant people would assume he couldn't properly care for a child, couldn't protect her, couldn't be a real parent. He'd faced that assumption his whole life, that he was less capable, less worthy, less human than everyone else. But he'd saved her. He'd carried her out of hell itself. Didn't that count for something? "I understand," Miguel said quietly, though his heart was breaking. Can I at least see her before they come?" Dr. Hernandez's expression softened. "She's sleeping. We've given her fluids, cleaned her wounds, gotten some food into her. But yes, you can see her. Room 2. Miguel stood, his legs feeling weak beneath him, and made his way to the examination room. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open slowly, careful not to make noise. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a monitor that beeped steadily with her heartbeat. She lay on the examination table, looking even smaller now that she'd been cleaned up, her face finally visible beneath the grime. She was beautiful, he realized. Delicate features, long eyelashes, a small mouth that even in sleep seemed to carry the memory of fear. Someone had dressed her in a hospital gown too big for her frame, and her hair had been washed, revealing its true color, a deep dark brown that reminded Miguel of his mother's hair. He moved closer, pulled a chair up beside the table, and sat down. For a long time, he just watched her breathe, watched the rise and fall of her chest, the flutter of her eyelids as she dreamed. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her, though she couldn't hear him. "I'm sorry for whatever happened to you. I'm sorry that the world is so cruel, but you're going to be okay now. I promise. Even if I can't stay with you, even if they take you somewhere else, you're going to be okay. You're going to have a good life. You deserve that." Her eyes opened. Just a crack at first, confused and unfocused. But then they found his face and something changed. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something else flickered. A tiny spark of recognition, of connection. She looked at him, really looked at him, and Miguel felt his breath catch in his throat. Slowly, carefully, she lifted one small hand from where it rested on the blanket. Miguel didn't move, didn't dare to breathe, as that tiny hand reached out toward him. And then her fingers, so small and fragile, wrapped around one of his fingers and held on. It was the smallest gesture, meaningless to anyone else. But to Miguel, in that moment, it was everything. It was trust. It was hope. It was a connection forged in the depths of despair and somehow, impossibly, beginning to grow into something more. He closed his eyes, his free hand coming up to cover hers, tears streaming down his face. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've got you, Pequeña. I'm here." The next few weeks were a storm of bureaucracy, interviews, and uncertainty. Child Protective Services arrived at the clinic within hours of Dr. Hernandez's call, and Miguel was questioned extensively. Who was he? What was he doing at the dump? Why did he take the girl instead of calling the police? What were his intentions? He answered every question honestly, his voice steady even when the caseworker, a stern woman named Mrs. Chen, looked at him with barely concealed skepticism. They searched for the girl's parents, ran her photo through missing children databases, posted appeals on social media. But nothing came back. No one claimed her. No one seemed to even know she existed. She was a ghost, a child without a past, without a name. The hospital staff started calling her Jane, but Miguel refused to use it. She wasn't Jane, some generic placeholder for an unclaimed life. She was someone, even if no one knew who yet. Miguel visited her every day after work, showing up at the hospital still dusty from the dump, smelling of garbage and sweat. The nurses wrinkled their noses when he passed, but he didn't care. All he cared about was the small room at the end of the hall where she waited for him. Because she did wait, the nurses told him that she barely responded to anyone else, barely ate unless Miguel was there to encourage her, barely slept unless she could see him sitting in the chair beside her bed. He brought her things. Small things, cheap things, because they were all he could afford. A stuffed rabbit from a street vendor, a picture book from a thrift store, a handful of colorful hair clips he found at a dollar store. She never smiled when he gave them to her, but she held them close, clutched them to her chest like treasures, and that was enough for him. Slowly, painfully slowly, she began to heal. The infections cleared. The cuts scabbed over and started to fade. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out, her ribs no longer visible through her skin. But the silence remained. Weeks passed, and she still hadn't spoken a word. Trauma, the doctors said. Sometimes children who've been through severe trauma lose their voice for a while. It might come back with time and therapy, or it might not. Miguel didn't care if she ever spoke. He just wanted her to be safe, to be happy, to know that she mattered. The day Mrs. Chen called him into her office at the CPS building, Miguel knew what was coming. He'd prepared himself for it, or at least he thought he had. He sat in the uncomfortable chair across from her desk, his feet not quite reaching the floor, and tried to keep his face neutral. "Mr. Santos," Mrs. Chen began, her tone professional but not unkind. "We've completed our investigation into the girl's case. We've found no family, no one who's reported her missing, no record of her birth or existence in any database we have access to. Legally, she becomes a ward of the state." Miguel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "We've identified a foster family willing to take her in," Mrs. Chen continued, glancing at the papers in front of her. "The Johnsons. They're experienced, have fostered several children successfully, have a large home in a good neighborhood. The girl will have her own room, access to counseling, good schools. It's an excellent placement." "I want to apply," Miguel said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "To be her foster parent, I want to apply." Mrs. Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, pity maybe, or discomfort. "Mr. Santos, I appreciate your attachment to the child, and I acknowledge that you saved her life. But foster care placement requires meeting certain criteria. You live in a studio apartment, correct? Work as a recycler at the city dump. Your income is barely enough for myself, I know," Miguel finished, his voice flat. "And I'm a dwarf, so obviously I can't take proper care of a child, right? That's what you're thinking." "I didn't say that," Mrs. Chen replied. But her face said she'd been thinking exactly that. "But the child's welfare must be our priority. She needs stability, resources, a safe environment." "She needs someone who loves her," Miguel said, his voice cracking. "Someone who sees her, who won't give up on her. She needs—" "Mr. Santos," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. "She doesn't even know your name." She hasn't spoken to anyone. While I understand you feel a connection to her, you've known her for less than a month. The Johnsons can provide for her in ways you simply cannot. I'm sorry, but the decision has been made. Miguel left that office feeling like he'd been hollowed out. He walked through the streets without seeing them, got on the bus without remembering the journey, ended up at the hospital because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. She was drawing when he entered her room, bent over a piece of paper with a crayon clutched in her small fist. Dr. Hernandez had given her coloring books and crayons to help with the trauma, to give her a way to express what she couldn't say out loud. Miguel had never looked at her drawings. They felt private, sacred, not meant for his eyes. But today, as he sank into his usual chair, she looked up at him with those huge dark eyes and did something she'd never done before. She held out the paper to him, an offering, a gift. Miguel took it with shaking hands and looked down at the crayon markings. It was crude, the way all children's drawings are, but the meaning was clear. Two figures, one very small, one smaller still, standing side by side. They were holding hands, and above them, drawn in bright yellow crayon, was a sun. Just a sun shining down on the two figures, warming them. Miguel's vision blurred. He pressed the drawing to his chest and wept, great shuddering sobs that shook his whole body. She watched him, her expression unreadable, and then she did something else she'd never done before. She climbed down from the hospital bed, walked over to him on unsteady legs, and put her small hand on his knee. He looked at her through his tears, and she looked back, and in that moment, something passed between them that needed no words. She knew. Somehow, despite everything, she knew what he was feeling, and she was trying, in her own small way, to comfort him. "They're going to take you away from me," Miguel whispered, his voice broken. "I tried to fight it, tried to make them understand, but they won't listen. They think I'm not good enough for you." She tilted her head, confused by his words but understanding his pain. Her hand tightened on his knee, and then she did something that split his heart clean open. She climbed into his lap, wrapped her thin arms around his neck, and held on. Just held on, as if she could keep them both from drowning through sheer force of will. Miguel wrapped his arms around her and held her back, memorizing the weight of her, the smell of the hospital shampoo in her hair, the feeling of her heart beating against his. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I know I don't have the right to say it. I know I'm nothing to you, but I love you, and I'm so sorry I can't protect you from this. I'm so sorry." The transfer was scheduled for the following Monday. Miguel used every penny of his meager savings to buy her things she could take with her: new clothes, the stuffed rabbit she loved, the picture books he'd been reading to her. He wrapped them carefully in a bag and brought them to the hospital on Sunday evening, his last night with her. They sat together in silence, her in his lap, him in the chair, both of them staring at the wall as if they could will time to stop moving forward. The nurses gave them privacy, understanding without being told that this was goodbye. Around 8 o'clock, Dr. Hernandez came in. She looked tired, older than usual, and when she saw them sitting there, her expression crumpled with sympathy. "Miguel," she said softly, "can I speak with you for a moment, outside?" Miguel didn't want to let go of the girl, but he gently lifted her off his lap and set her on the chair. "I'll be right back, Pequeña, I promise." In the hallway, Dr. Hernandez pulled him a few feet away from the door and turned to face him. "I called in some favors," she said without preamble. "I spoke to colleagues. I contacted a lawyer friend of mine who does pro bono family law work, and I may have threatened to make Mrs. Chen's life very difficult if she didn't reconsider." Miguel stared at her, not understanding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I fought for you," Dr. Hernandez replied, her eyes fierce. "Because that child in there? She's been through hell. She's been abandoned, abused, left to die in a garbage dump. And in all the time she's been here, the only person she's responded to, the only person she trusts, is you. Not the nurses, not me, not the volunteers who try to read to her. You, a man who works in the garbage, who has nothing, who society has written off as incapable. But you saw her when no one else did. You saved her when everyone else just threw her away. And I'll be damned if I let them take her away from the one person who actually loves her. They're still taking her tomorrow, Miguel said, his voice hollow. The decision has been reconsidered, Dr. Hernandez interrupted. If you're willing to fight for her, if you're willing to go through the full foster certification process, if you're willing to let them inspect your home and your life and jump through every hoop they throw at you, then you have a chance. It won't be easy. You'll need to find a bigger apartment, prove you can provide for her financially, go through training. But my lawyer friend is willing to take your case. And I've written a letter, as her doctor, stating that removing her from your care would be psychologically damaging. It's not a guarantee, but it's a chance. Miguel couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was hearing. Why would you do this for me? Dr. Hernandez smiled, a small, sad smile. Because I've been a doctor for 23 years, and I've seen a lot of families. Rich families, poor families, big families, small families. And you know what I've learned? Love isn't about money or status or living in the right neighborhood. It's about showing up. It's about caring when no one else does. That little girl has been invisible her whole short life, and you're the first person who actually saw her. That makes you her father, Miguel. Not biologically, maybe not even legally yet. But where it counts, you're already her dad. The tears came again, but this time they were different. This time, mixed in with the grief and fear, there was something else, something Miguel hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten what it was called. Hope. The next 6 months were the hardest of Miguel's life, and that was saying something given how hard his life had already been. He continued working at the dump, but he also took on a second job in the evenings, cleaning offices in the downtown business district. He slept 4 hours a night if he was lucky, and every penny he earned went toward creating a life that the state would deem acceptable for a child. He found a small 2-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood, but it was clean and had working heat and no cockroaches, which was more than his studio had offered. He furnished it with second-hand everything, a bed for her, a bed for him, a small table with 2 chairs, a lamp shaped like a cat that he found at a yard sale because he thought she might like it. He went through the foster certification process, sitting through hours of classes on child development and trauma-informed care, answering endless questions about his childhood, his relationships, his health. Some of the other prospective foster parents looked at him with confusion, others with outright disdain. But he showed up to every single class, completed every assignment, passed every background check. Throughout it all, he visited her. The hospital released her after a month into a temporary foster placement with an older woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who specialized in difficult cases. Mrs. Rodriguez, to Miguel's eternal gratitude, understood what he was trying to do and supported it. She let him visit, let him be part of the girl's life while the bureaucracy ground slowly forward. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the girl began to change. She still didn't speak, but she started to respond in other ways. A nod when Miguel asked if she was okay. A small smile when he brought her a flower he'd found growing wild by the road. A tighter grip on his hand when it was time for him to leave. 5 months after he'd found her in the dump, Miguel stood in a courtroom with his lawyer beside him and Mrs. Chen across the aisle. The judge, a stern-looking woman with gray hair and reading glasses, reviewed the case file with an expression that gave nothing away. "Mr. Santos," she said finally, looking at him over her glasses, "I've read all the reports. I've seen Dr. Hernandez's recommendation, Mrs. Rodriguez's glowing report of your involvement during the temporary placement and the completion of your certification process. I've also reviewed your financial situation and your living arrangements." Miguel's heart pounded so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "This is not a typical case," the judge continued. "But then again, very little about this situation has been typical. A child with no past, no identity, no voice. A man who society has largely overlooked stepping forward when no one else would. Mrs. Chen has expressed concerns about your ability to provide for this child, and I'll be honest with you, Mr. Santos. They're not unfounded concerns." Miguel felt his hope crumbling, but he forced himself to stay standing, to keep his eyes on the judge. "However," the judge said, her expression softening just slightly, "what this child needs more than financial security or a big house is stability and love. She needs someone who won't give up on her, who sees her value when the rest of the world saw only something to throw away. And from everything I've read, Mr. Santos, that person is you. Miguel's lawyer grabbed his arm to keep him from collapsing. I'm granting you provisional foster care custody, the judge declared. You will be subject to regular home visits and oversight from Child Protective Services. You will ensure the child receives ongoing counseling and medical care. And you will report any changes in your circumstances immediately. But as of today, she's in your care. Congratulations, Mr. Santos. You're a father. Miguel brought her home on a Tuesday afternoon, her small hand in his, her bag of belongings clutched in his other hand. They rode the bus together, and she pressed her face against the window, watching the world go by with wide eyes. When they got off at their stop, Miguel led her down the familiar streets to their building, up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment door. He unlocked it and pushed it open, and for a moment they just stood there in the doorway together. The apartment wasn't much. It was small and old, and the furniture was secondhand. But it was clean, and it was safe, and it was theirs. Welcome home, pequeña, Miguel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, those huge dark eyes searching his face, and then she did something that made his breath catch. She smiled, a real smile, small and tentative but absolutely genuine. And then, so quietly he almost didn't hear it, she spoke. Home. One word, just one word, but it was the first Miguel had ever heard from her. His knees went weak and he had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling. Yes, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Yes, mi amor. Home. She walked into the apartment, still holding his hand, and looked around with something that might have been wonder. She went to the room he'd prepared for her, with the small bed covered in a bright blue comforter and the lamp shaped like a cat on the nightstand. She touched the bed, then the lamp, then the stuffed rabbit he'd placed carefully on the pillow. Mine? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Yours, Miguel confirmed, crouching down to her level. All yours. Everything in this room belongs to you, and no one can take it away. She looked at him with something that might have been disbelief, as if she couldn't quite trust that this was real, that it wouldn't all disappear like a dream. Miguel understood that feeling. He'd been waiting his whole life for something good, something real, and now that he had it, part of him was terrified it would be snatched away. But it wasn't. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and slowly, carefully, they built a life together. It wasn't an easy life. Money was always tight, and Miguel worked himself to exhaustion to keep them afloat. But they had each other, and that made everything else bearable. She started speaking more, first in single words, then short sentences, then finally in the running stream of questions and observations that all children make. Miguel learned that she loved the color purple, that she was afraid of thunderstorms, that she laughed when he made silly faces while cooking dinner. He learned that she had nightmares sometimes, terrible ones that made her wake up screaming, and that the only thing that helped was when he held her and sang the lullabies his mother had once sung to him. She started calling him Papa 6 months after she came home. She said it casually one morning over breakfast, asking him to pass the milk, and Miguel had to excuse himself to the bathroom so she wouldn't see him cry. They enrolled her in school, and Miguel met with her teachers to explain her situation, to ask them to be patient with her, to understand that she was still healing from things they couldn't imagine. Most of them were kind. Some weren't. There were parents who didn't want their children playing with a girl who'd been found in a garbage dump, who whispered about where she'd come from and what might be wrong with her. And there were people who looked at Miguel with confusion or disgust when he showed up for parent-teacher conferences or school events, a dwarf claiming to be the father of this small, damaged child. But Miguel had spent his whole life dealing with people's cruelty and ignorance. He could handle it. What he couldn't handle was when someone hurt his daughter, because that's what she was now. Not legally adopted yet, but his in every way that mattered. The first time another child called her garbage girl at school, she came home in tears, her small body shaking with sobs. Miguel held her while she cried, his own heart breaking, wishing he could fight this battle for her, but knowing she'd have to learn to fight it herself. Listen to me, he said gently, lifting her chin so she'd look at him. People are going to say mean things sometimes. They're going to judge you for things that aren't your fault, for a past you didn't choose, and it's going to hurt. I won't lie to you about that. But you know what? She sniffled, waiting. None of it is true. You're not what they say you are. You're not where you came from. You're smart, you're brave, you're kind, and you're so strong. You survived things that would have broken most people, and you're still here. You're still standing. And every day you get to choose who you want to be. No one else gets to decide that for you. Not me. Not your teachers. Not the kids at school. Only you. She thought about this for a moment, her small face serious. Then she asked, "Do people say mean things about you too, Papa?" Miguel's throat tightened. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Because you're little?" "Yes." "That's stupid," she declared with a child's blunt honesty. "You're the best papa in the world." Miguel pulled her close and held her tight, wondering how it was possible to hurt and feel joy at the same time, to be broken and whole in the same breath. "And you're the best daughter in the world," he whispered into her hair. "Don't you ever forget that." Time passed. Seasons changed. The girl grew taller, stronger, more confident. The nightmares became less frequent. The silences became filled with laughter. On her 7th birthday, or at least the day Miguel had chosen as her birthday, since no one knew when she'd actually been born, he threw her a party in their small apartment. It wasn't much, just a few kids from school whose parents had been kind enough to let them come, some balloons from the dollar store, and a cake Miguel had stayed up all night baking. He'd never baked a cake before in his life, and it showed. The thing was lopsided, the frosting was lumpy, and he'd misspelled her name in the decoration. Her name, Sophia. She'd chosen it herself 6 months earlier, after months of Miguel calling her Pequeña and mi amor and sweetheart, because she'd never told him what to call her. They'd been reading a book together, one about a brave princess named Sophia, and she'd looked up at him with those serious eyes and said, "That's my name. Sophia." And so Sophia she became. The cake was a disaster, but Sophia's face when she saw it made every minute of struggle worthwhile. She lit up like the candles on top, her smile so big and bright it could have powered the whole building. The other children sang happy birthday, and she blew out the candles with one big breath, her eyes squeezed shut as she made a wish. Later, after the guests had left and the apartment was quiet again, Sophia sat on the couch next to Miguel, leaning against his side in the comfortable way children do when they feel completely safe. She was looking at the drawing she'd made all those months ago in the hospital, the one with the 2 figures holding hands under the sun. Miguel had framed it and hung it on the wall, and sometimes he'd catch her staring at it with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Papa," she said softly. "Yes, mi amor?" "What did I wish for?" Miguel smiled. "You're not supposed to tell, or it won't come true." "But I want to tell you," she insisted, looking up at him with those eyes that still sometimes held shadows of the terrified child he'd found in the dump, but more and more often held only light. "Okay then," Miguel said gently. "What did you wish for?" Sophia was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts the way she did when something was important. "I wished that you could be my papa forever. Not just foster, but real, like adoption real." Miguel's breath caught in his chest. They'd talked about adoption before, but always in vague terms, as something that might happen someday, when the time was right. The truth was that Miguel had been too afraid to hope for it, too afraid that somehow the state would find a reason to say no, to take her away from him. "That's my wish too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's been my wish since the day I found you." "Then let's do it," Sophia said with the simple certainty of a child who didn't yet understand how complicated the world could be. "Let's make it real." And so Miguel started the adoption process. More paperwork, more interviews, more home visits, more nights spent worrying that something would go wrong. But this time was different. This time, he had Sophia by his side, growing and thriving, undeniable proof that he was exactly what she needed. This time, he had Dr. Hernandez writing letters about Sophia's remarkable progress. He had Mrs. Rodriguez testifying about his dedication. He had Sophia's teachers talking about how far she'd come academically and socially. He even had some of the other parents from school, the kind ones, the ones who saw beyond circumstances and prejudices, writing letters of support. The adoption hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in March, nearly 2 years after Miguel had carried Sofia out of the dump. They dressed in their best clothes, Miguel in a suit he'd borrowed from a neighbor, Sofia in a purple dress she'd picked out herself. They held hands on the bus ride to the courthouse, both of them nervous, both of them trying to be brave for each other. The courtroom was less intimidating this time, maybe because Miguel knew what to expect, or maybe because he had Sofia next to him and that made him feel like he could face anything. The judge was the same woman who'd granted him foster custody, and she smiled when she saw them walk in together. The hearing was shorter than Miguel expected. The judge reviewed the case, asked Sofia a few gentle questions about whether she was happy, whether she felt safe, whether she wanted Miguel to be her forever father. Sofia answered each one with a clear, confident voice that made Miguel's heart swell with pride. Then the judge looked at Miguel and asked him the same question she'd asked nearly 2 years ago. "Mr. Santos, do you understand the responsibility you're taking on, the commitment required to be this child's legal parent?" Miguel didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. With everything I am, yes." The judge nodded, and her smile grew wider. "Then it gives me great pleasure to grant this adoption. Sofia Santos, you now officially and legally have a father. Mr. Santos, you officially and legally have a daughter. Congratulations to you both." The words took a moment to register. When they did, Sofia let out a small cry and threw her arms around Miguel's waist, holding him so tight he could barely breathe. He held her back just as tightly, tears streaming down his face, not caring who saw or what they thought. "We did it, Papa," Sofia whispered against his chest. "We're real now." "We were always real, mi amor," Miguel whispered back. From the very first moment. They celebrated that night with ice cream from the corner store and a movie on their old television. Sofia fell asleep halfway through, her head on Miguel's shoulder, one hand clutching his. Miguel didn't move, didn't want to disturb her, so he just sat there in the flickering light of the TV, looking at this miracle child who'd somehow become his. He thought about the day he'd found her, how broken she'd been, how close to death. He thought about all the people who'd said he couldn't do this, that a man like him couldn't be a proper father. He thought about all the struggles, the endless work, the sleepless nights, the fear that he'd somehow fail her. And then he looked at Sofia, peaceful and safe in sleep, and he knew that every single moment of struggle had been worth it. Every judgmental look, every cruel comment, every exhausting day of working 2 jobs, all of it was worth it for this, for her, for them. The years that followed weren't easy. Money was still tight, and Miguel's body wasn't getting any younger. The years of hard labor were catching up with him. His back ached, his joints hurt, and some mornings it was hard to get out of bed. But he got up anyway because Sofia needed breakfast before school. He went to work anyway because Sofia needed clothes and books and school supplies. He kept going because that's what fathers do. Sofia blossomed. She made friends, joined the school art club, discovered a love for reading that rivaled Miguel's own. She was smart, scoring high marks in all her subjects, and her teachers started talking about college, about scholarships, about possibilities that Miguel had never dreamed of for himself but desperately wanted for her. She was also kind, impossibly kind given everything she'd been through. She befriended the lonely kids at school, the ones who sat alone at lunch or got picked last in gym class. She volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends, spending hours caring for abandoned pets with the same gentleness Miguel had shown her. She saw the invisible people, the forgotten ones, because she'd been one of them. When Sofia was 10, Miguel's body finally gave him a clear warning. He collapsed at work one day, his back seizing up so badly he couldn't move. The other recyclers found him and called an ambulance, and he spent 3 days in the hospital while doctors told him what he already knew. He couldn't keep doing this kind of work. His body was breaking down. Sofia visited him every day, sitting beside his hospital bed and doing her homework, chattering about school and friends and everything that was happening in her life. She tried to hide her fear, but Miguel could see it in the way her hand shook when she held his, in the way she kept glancing at the monitors as if afraid they'd suddenly start screaming. "I'm okay, Pequeña," he assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just a little worn out." "You work too hard," Sophia said, her voice tight with worry. "You always work too hard." "I work as hard as I need to," Miguel replied, reaching out to smooth her hair. "That's what you do for the people you love." When he was released from the hospital, Miguel had to face reality. He couldn't go back to the dump. His body simply wouldn't allow it. But he also couldn't afford to not work. They needed money for rent, for food, for all the expenses that came with raising a child. It was Dr. Hernandez who came through for him again. She connected him with a community center that needed a maintenance supervisor. Nothing too physically demanding, mostly coordinating repairs and keeping things running smoothly. The pay was modest but steady, and it came with health insurance, which Miguel had never had before in his life. The job was perfect for him. He was good at fixing things, at solving problems, at making do with limited resources. And it meant regular hours, which meant he could be home when Sophia got out of school, could help her with homework, could be present in her life in ways he'd never been able to when he was working 2 jobs. Life settled into a rhythm, not an easy rhythm, but a steady one. Miguel and Sophia developed their routines: breakfast together every morning, walks in the park on Sundays, movie nights on Fridays. They were a team, a unit, a family in the truest sense of the word. But Sophia was growing up, and with that growth came questions. Questions about where she'd come from. Questions about why someone had left her in a dump. Questions about whether she had other family out there somewhere. People who might have missed her, might have looked for her. Miguel answered as honestly as he could, which sometimes meant saying, "I don't know." They'd never found any information about her past, no missing persons reports, no relatives searching for a lost child. It was as if she'd simply appeared in that dump, as if her life had started the moment Miguel found her. "Do you think my first parents loved me?" Sophia asked one night when she was 12, lying in bed while Miguel sat beside her. The nightmares had mostly stopped, but she still liked him to sit with her until she fell asleep. Miguel chose his words carefully. "I think love looks different for different people," he said slowly. "And I think sometimes people are in situations so bad, so impossible, that they make terrible choices. Maybe whoever left you there thought they were giving you a chance at survival. Maybe they were desperate. Or maybe they were cruel, and there's no good explanation. I honestly don't know, mi amor. But I know this: whatever happened before I found you, whatever the reasons were, they don't define who you are. You define who you are." Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't think I want to find them. My first parents, I mean, even if we could, because you're my real dad. You're the one who wanted me." Miguel's throat closed up. "I'll always want you," he managed to say. "Always." When Sophia turned 14, something shifted. She became more aware of the world around her, more conscious of how people saw them, a dwarf father and his adopted daughter with a mysterious past. She started noticing the stares, the whispers, the way some people treated Miguel with casual cruelty. One day, a boy at school made a joke about Miguel's height. Sophia, who'd always been quiet and gentle, punched him in the face. She got suspended for 3 days, and Miguel had to leave work early to pick her up from the principal's office. On the walk home, Sophia was silent, her jaw set in a stubborn line that reminded Miguel of himself. Finally, as they turned onto their street, she spoke. "I'm not sorry," she said fiercely. "He deserved it. They all deserve it. Everyone who's ever been mean to you." Miguel stopped walking. "Sophia, look at me." She did, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. "I appreciate you defending me," Miguel said gently. "But you can't punch everyone who says something cruel. You'll spend your whole life fighting, and you'll lose yourself in the anger. Trust me, I know. I've been dealing with this my whole life." "Then why don't you get angry?" Sophia demanded. "How can you just let them treat you like that?" "Because getting angry would mean letting them win," Miguel explained. "Would mean letting them make me into something small and bitter and mean. I chose a long time ago not to give them that power. I chose to be kind instead, to be gentle, to be better than the cruelty around me. And you know what? That choice led me to you. If I'd been angry, if I'd been bitter, I might have walked past a child crying in a dump. I might not have heard you. But because I still had gentleness in me, because I hadn't let the world break me, I found you. And you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Sophia's anger crumbled, replaced by tears. I just hate that they hurt you. I know, Miguel said, pulling her into a hug. And I hate that they hurt you too. But we're stronger than them, you and me. We're stronger because we have each other. Because we chose love when everyone else chose hate. That's what makes us powerful, mi amor. Not violence. Not anger. Love. Sophia's high school years brought new challenges and new joys. She threw herself into her studies, determined to make something of herself, to prove that she was more than the child found in a dump. She worked part-time at the community center where Miguel was employed, tutoring younger kids in reading and math. College applications were daunting. Sophia wanted to study social work, wanted to help other children who'd been forgotten or abandoned like she had been. But college cost money they didn't have, and Miguel's modest salary wouldn't stretch to cover tuition. They applied for every scholarship they could find, wrote essays about Sophia's journey, her resilience, her dreams, and slowly, incredibly, the acceptances started coming in. Scholarships, grants, financial aid packages. Not enough to cover everything, but enough. Enough that she could go. The day Sophia got her acceptance letter from the state university with a full scholarship attached, she ran all the way home from school, bursting through the apartment door with the letter clutched in her hand. Miguel was cooking dinner, and he turned just in time to catch her as she launched herself at him, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. "I did it, Papa," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I actually did it." "Of course you did," Miguel said, his voice thick with pride and tears. "I never doubted you for a second." That night they celebrated with sparkling grape juice in champagne glasses from the thrift store and the lopsided cake Miguel had attempted to bake again. It was just the two of them in their small apartment, but it felt like the whole world was celebrating with them. As they sat together on the couch afterward, Sophia's head on Miguel's shoulder like she used to do when she was small, she said quietly, "I'm scared." "Of what?" Miguel asked. "Of leaving you. Of being away from home. Of failing. Of everything." Miguel kissed the top of her head. "Being scared is okay. Being scared means you care about what you're doing. And you're not going to fail, Sophia. You're going to do amazing things. You're going to help people the way I helped you. The way you've helped me." "How did I help you?" Sophia asked, genuinely confused. "You saved me, Papa. You gave me everything." "You gave me everything too," Miguel said softly. "You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to be better than I was. You made me a father, which is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Before you, I was just surviving. After you, I started living. So yes, mi amor, you saved me too. We saved each other." Sophia left for college on a bright September morning. Miguel helped her pack everything into boxes, drove her to campus in a borrowed car, helped her move into her dorm room. Other students' families were there too, mothers and fathers, siblings, grandparents, whole crowds of people. Sophia just had Miguel, but when she looked at him, her eyes said he was enough, more than enough. When it was time to say goodbye, Sophia clung to him like she had when she was little, like she was afraid to let go. "I love you, Papa," she whispered. "I love you too, mi amor," Miguel whispered back. "More than all the stars in the sky. Now go. Go and be brilliant. I'll be right here when you need me." The drive home was the longest of Miguel's life. The apartment felt too empty, too quiet without Sophia's presence filling it. He made dinner for one and ate in silence. He went to bed early but couldn't sleep, kept listening for sounds that weren't there. Sophia's laughter, her footsteps, her voice calling him for help with homework. But he'd learned long ago that love sometimes means letting go, means giving people the space to grow even when it tears your heart in half. So he endured the emptiness, went to work every day, called Sophia every evening to hear about her classes and her new friends, and the world she was discovering. She came home for Thanksgiving, and Christmas, and spring break, and suddenly 4 years had passed and she was graduating with honors in social work. Miguel sat in the audience with tears streaming down his face as Sophia walked across the stage to receive her diploma, and when she found him afterward in the crowd, she was crying too. "We did it," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken in the courtroom all those years ago. "You did it," Miguel corrected. "This is all you, mi amor." "No," Sophia said firmly. "This is us. Everything I am, everything I've accomplished, it's because of you. Because you saw me when no one else did. Because you loved me when no one else would." Sophia got a job at a children's advocacy center, working with kids in the foster system, kids who'd been abused or neglected or forgotten. She was brilliant at it. Everyone said so. She had a way of connecting with even the most traumatized children, of making them feel seen and valued. She knew their pain because she'd lived it. She knew their fear because she'd felt it. And she knew their hope because Miguel had given it to her. On the 5th anniversary of her graduation, Sophia came home for dinner. It was a Sunday, and Miguel made her favorite meal, arroz con pollo, the way his mother used to make it. They ate and talked and laughed, and then Sophia pulled out an envelope from her bag. "I have something for you," she said, sliding it across the table. Miguel opened it carefully, pulled out the papers inside, and began to read. His hands started shaking halfway through the first page. It was an invitation to an award ceremony where Sophia was being honored as Social Worker of the Year for her outstanding work with foster children. "Sophia," Miguel breathed, looking up at her with wide eyes. This is incredible." "Read the rest," Sophia urged, smiling. Miguel turned to the second page and found another document. A speech. Sophia's acceptance speech, which she'd already written. But it wasn't about her work or her accomplishments. It was about him. About a man who worked in a garbage dump and found a dying child. About a father who fought the whole world to keep her. About love that refused to be defeated by poverty or prejudice or pain. About how one person's kindness could change the trajectory of an entire life. "I'm going to tell them," Sophia said softly, watching his reaction. "I'm going to tell them all about you, Papa, about what you did for me, about what real love looks like." Miguel couldn't speak. He just sat there with tears running down his face, holding the papers like they were made of gold. "You always told me I'd do amazing things," Sophia continued, her own voice breaking with emotion. "But the truth is, you're the one who did amazing things. You took a broken, silent, terrified child and turned her into someone who could help others. You gave me everything. Safety, love, purpose, hope. And I want the world to know. I want them to know that heroes don't always look the way we expect them to. Sometimes they're 4 feet tall. Sometimes they work in garbage dumps. Sometimes they're the people society overlooks and underestimates. But they're heroes anyway." Miguel stood up and walked around the table, pulled Sophia into his arms, and held her the way he'd held her that first day in the hospital. The way he'd held her through nightmares and tears, and every hard moment in between. "You're the hero of this story," he whispered into her hair. "Not me. You survived. You fought. You became this incredible person despite everything that tried to destroy you. I just loved you. That's all I ever did." "That's everything," Sophia whispered back. "Love is everything." The award ceremony was held in a grand hotel downtown, full of important people in expensive clothes. Miguel felt out of place in his borrowed suit, felt the familiar weight of people's stares as he made his way through the crowd. But Sophia held his hand tight, her head held high, and together they walked to their table like they owned the place. When Sophia's name was called, the room erupted in applause. She walked to the stage with grace and confidence, accepted the crystal trophy with a smile, and then stepped up to the microphone. Miguel's heart swelled with pride, so intense it was almost painful. Sophia began her speech, and the room fell silent. She told their story, all of it. The dump, the hospital, the fight for custody, the adoption. She talked about poverty and prejudice, about how society treats people it deems less valuable, less worthy. She talked about her nightmares and her healing, about learning to trust again, to hope again, to love again. And then she looked directly at Miguel, sitting in the audience with tears streaming down his face, and said, "My father taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It's about showing up. It's about choosing someone every single day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. He showed up for me when I was at my absolute lowest, when I was literally garbage in the world's eyes. And he's been showing up every day since. Papa, if you're wondering whether you did enough, whether you gave me enough, the answer is yes. 1,000 times yes. You gave me the world." The room erupted in applause again, but Miguel barely heard it. He was crying too hard, his whole body shaking with the force of his emotions. People at nearby tables were crying too, reaching out to touch his shoulder, to tell him how moved they were, how inspired. After the ceremony, after the photographs and the congratulations and the long drive home, Miguel and Sofia sat together in their small apartment one more time. Sofia was moving out next week, had found a place closer to her work. She was 26 years old now, a grown woman with her own life, her own path, but she would always be his pequeña, his miracle, his daughter. "Thank you," Miguel said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence, "for everything you said tonight, for loving me despite everything, for not being ashamed of where you came from, or who I am." Sofia looked at him with those eyes that had once been so full of fear and were now so full of light. "Papa, I could never be ashamed of you. You're the best man I've ever known, the bravest, the kindest, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be half as good as you are." "You're already better," Miguel said with absolute certainty. "You're already so much better." They sat together until late into the night, talking about everything and nothing, remembering the journey that had brought them from a garbage dump to this moment. They laughed about the lopsided cakes and the too small apartment, and all the times they'd had to make do with almost nothing. They cried about the hard times, the cruel words, the battles they'd fought together. And when it was finally time for Sofia to go home to her own place, when she hugged Miguel goodbye at the door, she whispered the same words she'd whispered on her 7th birthday, on her graduation day, on every important moment they'd shared. "I love you, Papa, forever and always. Forever and always, mi amor," Miguel whispered back. After she left, Miguel walked back into the apartment and looked around at the small space that had held their entire world. On the wall still hung the drawing Sofia had made in the hospital all those years ago, 2 figures holding hands under the sun. He walked over to it, traced the crayon lines with one finger, and smiled through his tears. He thought about the man he'd been before Sofia, working in the dump, invisible to the world, convinced he'd never matter to anyone. And he thought about who he'd become, a father, a hero in his daughter's eyes, someone who'd changed a life simply by refusing to walk past suffering. Miguel Santos was still 4 feet tall. He still lived in a modest apartment in a rough neighborhood. He still worked a humble job that would never make him rich or famous. But he had loved a child who needed love. He had saved a life that needed saving. He had been exactly what one person needed, exactly when she needed it. And that, he realized, was more than enough. That was everything. Years later, when Miguel was much older, when his hair had gone completely gray and his joints ached even more than they used to, he would sit in his favorite chair and watch Sofia with her own children. 2 adopted kids, a boy and a girl, both from difficult backgrounds, both given a second chance at life the way Sofia had been. He would watch her be the mother she'd never had, the kind of mother he'd tried to be as a father. He would see his gentleness reflected in her parenting, his patience, his unwavering belief that every child deserves love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the grandchildren were asleep, and it was just him and Sofia sitting together like they used to, she would look at him with those same dark eyes that had stared up at him from that pile of garbage so many years ago and say, "Thank you for finding me, Papa." And he would always reply, "Thank you for letting me." Because that was the truth of it. They had saved each other. A dwarf man that society had written off, and a little girl that someone had thrown away. Two people the world had deemed unworthy, coming together to create something beautiful. A family, a love story, a miracle. And in the end, that's what life is really about, isn't it? Not the grand gestures or the perfect circumstances or the fairy tale endings. It's about seeing someone when no one else does. It's about showing up day after day, through the hard times and the good times. It's about choosing love when the world chooses hate. It's about being someone's hero, even when, especially when, you don't feel like a hero at all. Miguel Santos was a hero. Not because he was special or extraordinary, but because he was kind when kindness mattered most. Because he loved when love was desperately needed. Because he refused to walk past a child in need, even when helping her would cost him everything. And Sofia Santos was a hero too. Not because she overcame her trauma or achieved great things in her career, but because she took the love she'd been given and multiplied it, passed it on to others who needed it just as desperately as she once had. Their story isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. It's about the power of one person refusing to give up on another. It's about what happens when someone decides that love matters more than comfort, more than money, more than what other people think. This is their story, the story of a little girl forgotten in a dump, and the dwarf single dad who appeared and changed everything, not through magic or miracles, but through something far more powerful and far more rare. Genuine, unconditional, transformative love. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments.
Tell me where you're watching from, and what moment in Miguel and Sofia's journey moved you the most. Was it when he first found her in the dump? When she called him Papa for the first time? When she defended him at school? Or when she honored him at that award ceremony? Your thoughts mean everything to us, and hearing how this story affected you helps us understand what resonates with people. And if you felt something, whether it was tears, hope, or just a reminder that good people still exist in this world, please hit that like button. It really does make a huge difference in helping this channel grow and reach more people who need to hear stories like this. Stories about real love, about people who don't give up, about how, even in the darkest places, light can find a way through. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for being part of this community. Until next time, remember, you never know when you might be someone's Miguel, when you might be the one person who sees someone others have overlooked. So keep your eyes open, keep your heart soft, and never, ever walk past suffering when you have the power to help. Take care of each other out there.